Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very exciting installment of Heartbeat Radio. I am your co-host, Matthew Mers, and we have an amazing show today. Bruce is already on the line and ready to go because for the next hour and change, we are going to talk about the fantastic history of Montreal wrestling. We have two very special guests. One of them is on the line right now, so I'd like to welcome to the show the co-writer of Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs, The Untold Story of How Montreal Shaped the World of Wrestling, professional wrestling historian Pat Laprade. Welcome to the show, Pat. Thanks for joining us. I'll let you and Bruce go ahead and get to it. I'm going to sit back and just listen and learn.
Hey, guys. Thank you for having me.
I just had a chance to catch up on your book, Pat. You and Bertrand did a hell of a job. I covered a lot of ground with your book in Montreal, which was always one of the kind of hotbeds of wrestling for years and years. And I know my dad always used to have a particular interest in Montreal, which is kind of one reason why he seemed to always have all kinds of the Montreal-based guys kind of some of our best talent.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that a lot of the Montreal guys work for your dad in Calgary, and I always thought that Montreal and Toronto and Calgary were the perennial three Canadian cities as far as wrestling goes. Montreal and Calgary pretty much had the same kind of ending when WWF at the time took over. But it was two great territories, back in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. So it's gonna be a fun time tonight.
Yeah, I was booking Calgary from about 1980 on, so I actually, when I first was breaking into the business in the early 70s, I had an old guy who would actually come down here from Montreal, but he had been a Hispanic guy. His name was Frank Butcher, but he spent a lot of time with me in the gym, and one of the main guys I trained with back in those days was Michel Martel's brother, Rick Martel, who was just kind of breaking in at that time. And I was sort of, we had a pretty good contingent of French-Canadian guys during that stretch, including Michel Martel and Don Gagne or Frenchie Martin, and I think Neil Gay, the Hangman, was out here around that stretch, and our old friend Abby, Larry Shreve, Abdullah the Butcher. So there was a very pronounced French-Canadian flavor in here. And as I got into the business, my dad told me that a lot of his top guys back in the 50s and 60s were French-Canadian guys like Tarzan Tourville, or Tarzan Tyler as he came to be known, and the Baylor Jeans and Maurice Lapointe and Mad Dog and Paul Vachon, and they had that big, he's kind of a hapless big oddity named the Great Antonio. I think they pulled one of the all-time great Mabel parties on him. But
I was going to say it's one of the all-time great rib story about with the Vachons and the Great Antonio in Calgary. I mean, the Vachons was only there for 6 or 7 months, but still today we talk about the Vachons.
I think they were the main perpetrators, and they pulled that Mabel. I'm not sure if some of the fans are familiar with even what a Mabel party is, but they did that Mabel party on Antonio, and it kind of developed into a full-blown thing with the police, and Antonio was so scared and upset that he begged the police to let him spend the night in jail because he was afraid of maybe further consequences and all like that. And
well, yeah, they were. For the people listening, the thing was that one of the, the Mabel rib was about making one of the guys believe that there was a very, very good-looking girl with her husband out of town and ready to sleep with another guy, another
boy. Oh yeah,
boy.
she was enamored or had the hots for this particular guy, and then they would finally set up the big date, and they would always, of course, tell the victim that Mabel liked to drink and party a bit before, so he would always bring over all this food and all this, wine and beer and stuff, so the wrestlers would all be indulging in it behind the scenes, and then at some point when the victim was about ready to get it on with Mabel, Mabel's husband would burst in with a gun, and he'd usually shoot the guy who introduced the victim to Mabel. He was one of the other wrestlers. I think Maurice was one of the guys.
Yeah, in this case, Maurice was temporarily killed by by the husband, and
he had a
firmly believed that Maurice was just just dead, and he was just completely went berserk. And yeah, like you said, the police got involved in it. And
my dad told me that Antonio took off running into the night. He's always out in the country somewhere, and my dad told me Antonio ran, right into a barbed wire fence in the dark and cut himself all up, and then kept running.
Yeah, for those who don't know who Antonio was, he was maybe 6'1", 350. At least 350 pounds. Used to, speed of strength of pulling buses with his hair. So to him, running like this was maybe a first,
Yeah, and he didn't speak English either. I think he was Russian or
he was
Ukrainian.
From Yugoslavia. Yeah,
I think it was around that time they pulled that Mabel party on this other guy named Don Jardine. I'm not sure if he was from down east, but one of the guys who pulled the rib was Stan Stasiak, who was also up here for a long stretch. And I was told about 15 years later, Don Jardine, the spoiler, as some fans might know him in the States, he was down in Dallas, and Stasiak came into the territory and was chuckling about the Mabel party they had pulled on Don Jardine, and Jardine was that incensed he came up and hit Stasiak, and they got into a big fight in the dressing room. It's like 15 years after the fact, but Jardine was still that upset about the Mabel party. But that was all part of it. I don't want to digress into all the.
Hey, I've got to jump in here real quick, guys. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have Pat's co-writer on the book, Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs, is calling in right now, so I want to bring him on the line. Ladies and gentlemen, another fantastic Canadian wrestling historian, Bertrand Hebert.
Yes, good evening, everyone.
Nice to hear from you, Bertrand. I'd love to hear some perspectives from you guys just on what inspired you guys to write the book, and some of the things you found most interesting when you were writing it. You guys covered an incredible amount of history in there from all the way the heck back in the turn of the 1900s to the present. So you covered everyone from way back long before Yvonne Robert and some of those other legendary people. But it certainly was one of the most productive and colorful promotions or territories in the history of the business.
Well, actually, the idea came. I was supposed to. At first, it wasn't supposed to be a whole book. on the history of Montreal wrestling. It was supposed to be only a ranking of the top 25 Quebec wrestlers of all time. That was the idea from the start. And then after starting, compiling everything and talking about, what will be, the biographies of the top 25 guys and stuff, the idea came to do more than that and to tell other kind of stories, than just biographies of the top 25 Quebec wrestlers of all time. And I reached to Bertrand in the summer of 2009 to give me a hand with all this, and he jumped right in, and we worked from there we worked for nearly 4 years on the book and doing researches and talking to almost every Quebec wrestlers still alive today, that almost everybody agreed to do interviews for us and share their personal photo collections and stuff like that. So it was really such a fun time to just talk to these guys and get their stories taped and written, because nobody is getting any younger, right? Gino Brito, Paul Leduc, we lost, along the way we lost, guys like Yvon Robert Jr. and Edouard Carpentier and Mad Dog Vachon most recently, and Hans Schmidt, and it was important for us to get the stories out of those guys, before it just gets too late.
Exactly.
If they're bringing their stories with them, they will be lost forever. So it was important for us, and I would say that maybe one of the most fascinating things I've learned through all those researchers and work is probably that the midget wrestling. We everybody know about midget wrestling and guys like Lil Beaver and Sky Lolo, and there were many guys coming from the province of Quebec. What I didn't know was that, well, unless proven otherwise, the very first midget wrestling match actually happened in Montreal at the end of the 40s in 1949 with Sky Lolo before he became Sky Lolo, and I mean it was just a really good, a really good fact to actually add to the book. We knew that midget wrestling and that the promoter, a guy that Calgary knows very well, a guy named Jack Britton, Gino Brito's father, that he was another guy from Quebec that actually was the promoter for all the midget wrestling. But it was it was a good thing to actually know what happened just before Britain took over all the midget wrestling and made it, such a popular act throughout the world. So I think from my part, it was maybe one of the most fascinating fact I learned along the way. I don't know and I'm sure Bertrand has another. There were so many, and I'm sure Bertrand can share another one that is maybe closer to him.
Yeah, for sure. I think, when we learn, there was always that, why did Yvon Roberts help start Grand Prix and run shows against the Rougeau and All-Star Wrestling? It just didn't make any sense because, before they were friends, and then supposedly there were no wrestling in Montreal for a while, and Johnny Rougeau started All-Star. But it something was missing there, but nobody was talking, and there was never any idea what exactly was the trigger for Yvon Robert to start an opposition group to the Rougeau. And as we digged along and talked to a few people, a few clues were dropped in our lap, and then Pat did some research at the archives, and then we put A, B, C, then somebody finally spilled some of the beans on us so we could like complete the puzzle. And we learned that there was some sort of falling out between Rougeau and Robert, and from there that's when Robert decided that he wanted to start an opposition group to his former protege. And that's where he went to Minneapolis, and he got Mad Dog, and he got Paul Vachon to get involved. He brought his son back to Montreal at the same time, and they put together what will become Grand Prix with Edouard Carpentier as well. So that was like one huge piece of the puzzle that was missing, that didn't make sense. We didn't know why, and we didn't know what was going on at that point in time, because there was no record or there was no explanation of anything. And to find that piece, that was really awesome, and I think it's a great piece of history that we've put together while we were doing the book.
Yeah, that was a pretty pronounced period there, early 70s, I would say, 73, somewhere in there. And I remember my dad, he had kind of, he always had a pretty good relationship with all those guys, and all of a sudden there was this big war going on, and my dad had previously been he had a lot of those guys like Kowalski and Abbey and Leduc and some of those other guys, and it was kind of it became a pretty big time story though, and for a while there I think Grand Prix was doing pretty good business. I never quite heard what finally happened there, but it was kind of it was one of the first big kind of wars or conflicts in the business back in the 70s, kind of a precursor of some of the stuff that happened a decade later,
It was pretty much what WWF and WCW had, it was as hot as a feud as they would have had in the 90s. They were stealing, they were signing talents away from each other. They were fighting for the same fans, the same venues, and it ended up, being very, very wealthy for the guys, of course, because they could, lure big contracts, since there were bidding war over there, and also, the fans. I mean, the two weekly shows on TV together, most of the weeks, used to do something like 2 million fans watching their shows every week. I mean, that's 1 million each. That and it's in the 70s. We're not talking about now, and it's in a province that at the time probably had 5 or 6 million people. We're not talking about the United States with their 200 or 300 million people. So, I mean, that was really unheard of. And it didn't last very long. It lasted for maybe a good 2 years. But, at the end, Grand Prix had too many chiefs and not enough not enough Indians. And that's what, killed them. And that's why Paul and Maurice, at the end of 1973, decided to sell their shares of the company. And, I mean, a year later, the company folded. So, I mean, it really, really was a huge, huge feud, but for a very short period of time.
Yeah, I remember my dad got a lot of guys almost that were casualties of that. Most people don't remember, but they actually had started in Montreal around that time was the Bushwhackers, but they were called the Kiwis at that time. Crazy Nick and Sweet William, and then my dad got a lot of Japanese guys around that time, including Tokyo Joe, who unfortunately lost his leg in a car accident not that long after he came in here. And I think, oddly enough, Jacques Rougeau came in here a few years after that. He was wrestling under the name of Jimmy Rougeau. We had quite a few other French-Canadian guys that were more from the Maritimes, but they seemed to work Montreal, like the Cormiers there. The Beast and Leo Burke and Rudy Kay and Bobby Burke, and most of them were French Canadians, but they had all English names like Freddie Sweetan, and it was an amazing kind of migration of those French Canadians. I guess Joe and Paul Leduc were in here in and around that period, and Abby was up here kind of for a pretty prolonged stretch during that period, but he would still go down and do stuff with the Sheik and Eddie Krietzman and some of those guys back home, and so it was a huge French Canadian flavor up here for sure.
Yeah. Calgary was always a stop for a lot of people starting to get work outside of their own territory in Canada. Like in Montreal, we sometimes had people like the Mike Shaw, I think, who became Bastion Booger. He came through Montreal at some point also, and there was other people, like you said, like Leo Berg, who did come to Montreal from the Maritimes, as he was sometimes going in between. Before getting to Calgary, he would go through Montreal, coming from the Maritimes. So, all the big territory in Canada traded talent on a fairly regular basis to get talent because, as of today, it's much easier to get work inside Canada than to get to work in the U.S. first. And then you need to build your name, so getting to the big places, the big territory in Canada was always a plus for all the talents in Canada.
Another guy I failed to mention, but he also had a pretty good run in here, was old Gilles Poisson. He was kind of a crony of Abby's, and I think he originally came in under the name of Alex the Butcher or something like that. I don't know where that. I think Jack Britton sent him out here, but even there was a few lesser lights that people almost forget. I remember a guy named Chin Lee who was French Canadian, but he looked like he was Manchurian or something.
Yeah, we've heard
Claude
a lot
Johnson
about Chin Lee as we were doing the book because he was a big star in Mexico and in Montreal. A lot of guys give him credit for training them and getting
pretty good
them
guy.
to learn how to work and stuff like that. He's a very underrated talent, that Chin Lee, and that a lot of guys respect. And he went everywhere, and because he looked like he was Manchurian or Mexican at the most, nobody ever put two and two together that he was actually from Canada.
Yeah, he tagged with another Japanese guy up here that you guys probably know named Sugi Sito, who was
in Montreal.
I think he actually was
Mr.
Japanese,
Ito.
but he had been in Montreal for a long stretch with Chin Lee, and they're pretty good buddies of Abby, and most of them were damn good workers. So that's bottom line with almost all of them. And
the only thing, the other thing, Bruce, is the fact that going from Montreal to Canada, you didn't need any papers, didn't need any visas, didn't need any passport. You could travel, as much as you wanted from Montreal to Calgary. I mean, so even if the drive is quite a ride, at least they were able to work within the same country. So it was probably another reason why guys from Canada work Toronto and Montreal and Calgary and the Maritimes, because they didn't need any paper to actually work in those places, like you did when you were going south to the United States.
It was tough back in the you guys probably have heard that from a lot of the guys you interviewed, but back in those days it was tough to get a green card, as they said. I remember it was tough. Even my brother Brett back in the day, he was wanting to work in the States before he went to WWE, and my mother was born in the States. She was able to kind of finally, but it was tough even for him. But I remember it was just a common problem for a lot of those French Canadians and Canadians in general to get work in the States. It was kind of
that's why I always thought that WWE, in the perfect world, should not only get and have a training facility or developmental territory in the States, but they should get one in Canada and maybe in the UK, so that they don't have to spend that much on green cards and visas, and they can actually evaluate the talent before bringing them to the United States.
I said that for a long time, and I'm glad you said that, because for me, that's one of the big problems with the business right now, and it's becoming a more prevalent in the last decade is the lack of new talent, and there's no substitute for actually just going out and working for like a few years, 5-6 days a week, like the territories used to do, and just learning how to work and experimenting and trying different characters and being a heel and a face and all this other, and I think something like that is something the WWE that's been one of the biggest problems and continues to be.
And I'm sure, Ruth, that guys, talent from Canada could have shown what they could do a lot sooner than when WWE actually were aware of them. Guys like Tyson Kidd down in Calgary, or guys in Montreal like Kevin Steen and now Sami Zayn. But other guys. We have a guy in Montreal named Frankie the Mobster, who's a tremendous talent and could have benefited from such a developmental territory down here. And I always heard the story about Bobby Roode. It was with TNA now, who got who wasn't taken by WWE, even though Jim Ross was pushing for him, because of this particular reason, where it was maybe too expensive to bring him to the States and take a chance on him. But they could have they could have taken a chance on him if he would have been staying in Toronto or in Canada. And be trained by WWE standards. So I think that's something that people throughout Canada could really benefit from, and the same in the UK, which is another big territory where WWE take a lot of their talents. So this is something that could help not only the Montreal guys, but all over Canada as well.
The young guys don't have anyone schooling them, and they got all these script writers and ass kissers who are not fit to be bookers, concocting all these storylines and all this other, but nobody's really schooling them. Nobody's taking them aside and giving them all the kind of inside dialogue on the subtleties of the business, and that used to be such a big part of it back in the day. Any of the rookies were up
I think it's it's slowly we're going to see the difference now on the long term with the way the performance center is now set up, and the way they're schooling the new kids. I think with the last takeover last week, they really did a great job. They had a fantastic main event. And when they had the guys from NXT on Raw, they really showed up all the talent that they were there to play, and that they knew what they were doing. And I think the schooling and the time they're spending on their performance center might change that in the future if we give them the chance. I think the one before that, Natalia, had a great match with Ric Flair's daughter. And I think, hopefully, we're seeing a change in a very good direction in the future about that.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if we were talking about trainer in Montreal, there was a guy called Pat Girard, who I think did quite the career in Europe, and he was, the trainer of a lot of the talent in the late 50s. And,
yeah, I remember hearing that name.
Up until the early 80s, he trained mostly everybody that ever came through the province in some way at some point. So that was a really good trainer. He trained Terry Garvin, Pat Patterson, among others, and Ronnie Garvin also went there. So it's each territory like Montreal had someone like that at some point that became a trainer, that really got it and really got through to the guys and was able to produce quite a fine list of talent, even though his own career became a little bit lost in the process. And before him, we had another Frenchman from France, before Carpentier, called Émile Maupas, who was the trainer of Yvon Robert and others. Bob Langevin, among others. So, there's always that guy or that training school, like your dad in Calgary, that really got it and produced quite the list of talent. So each territory that was really successful had the the chance to have someone like that who was turning up talent, because it's always that business is always about producing the next star, and to do that, well, you need to produce great talent, and the Montreal territory, created a local guy, but also, the Abdullah the Butcher thing became very interesting in Montreal. Then Andre got his start in Montreal as well with his gimmick. Kowalski, was another one who was in Montreal, and that accident happened with Yukon Eric, which is probably one of the most famous story in pro wrestling, when he ripped off the hair of Yukon Eric in the ring
in your book,
and he became Keller Kowalski after that. So
wow.
It's not always about producing the local guy. It's also getting that talent, that raw talent from somewhere else, and like Ivan Koloff, giving him a new name and a new gimmick.
He was doing jobs in Vancouver for 10 years.
Exactly.
Red McNulty, and never thought anything would come of him. And then next thing you know, he's WWE champion, and he's
and the rest is history, as they say. So so it's always a timing and having those places where talent can become somebody, and Montreal always turn up a lot of talent along the way.
I remember a name my dad used to talk about quite a bit, maybe in the early 50s, a guy named Guy LaRose. He sort of parlayed, he switched to this German heel gimmick. There was still a fair bit of heat. My dad had another big guy he was breaking in here at that time named Jack Adkisson, who was later on to become Fritz von Erich. But they kind of both parlayed that post-war resentment about the Nazis and all like that. And Guy LaRose, my dad told me, became one of the top heels in the early mid-50s, and I think my dad said he did good business in Chicago and all over as Hans Schmidt, and he became a pretty legendary heel, and Montreal was turning out quite a few of those guys like Kowalski and Schmidt, and later on Mad Dog, and I think Tarzan Tyler had a pretty good run. He had some injuries and stuff, but he was a pretty highly respected heel in the 60s there, and he kind of got his feet wet out here. I remember my dad telling me all those guys, Stasiak was another one. He originally had come in as Emil the Cat covertly, and then changed his name after that to Stan Stasiak, after some old guy who worked in the 20s and 30s or something named Stan Stasiak. But those guys were all pretty prominent.
Stan Stasiak, Bruce, who is the only guy coming from actually, I was going to say the only guy, but it was the first guy who from the province of Quebec became then WWF champion for only 9 days. But still,
he was sort of a transition between Bruno and Pedro or something like that. Or
yeah, exactly. So I mean, it was he was known as he was known to be a very strong wrestler who had that hard punch as a finisher, and had
the Arvida assassin up here or something like that. He was from, I was told, Arvida
from northern Quebec, exactly, from near Saguenay, and had a very good career in the States, especially in Oregon, where he was a huge star for years and years and years. And that's what's fantastic about the book, is that for people who live in Quebec and knew about the Rougeaus and the Vachons and all those local guys, they knew about them, and they knew about what they did in the province of Quebec, but they didn't really know what they did outside of the province of Quebec. So the book, is not only talking about the story of the Montreal wrestling territory, but also what the Montreal guys or the province of Quebec guys did elsewhere. And for someone outside the province, whether it's Calgary or Toronto or even in the States, the fans will learn about, they will read about guys that they heard of, that they probably saw wrestling in their own territory without even knowing that so and so were actually from the province of Quebec, and they will learn about what they did in Quebec on top of, remembering memories of what they did in Portland or in Texas or in Calgary. So I mean, we kind of get the best of both worlds with the book, because and we were able to get that reaction from the fans when we did. Me and Bertrand last year did a lot of those conventions, and we were in Charlotte, and people were talking to us about Dino Bravo and Paul Vachon and guys that worked Charlotte for years. And then we were in Iowa, in Waterloo, Iowa, and people still remembered, of course, Mad Dog Vachon, but guys like Rick Martel and guys who worked AWA, because AWA was the big promotion, working Iowa. Everywhere we went, there were people and fans talking to us about, guys from the province of Quebec that wrestled there, and I guess, at the time, people didn't really know where they were really coming from, and like you said, at the time, who really knew? You had a German guy coming from northern Quebec, and you had another German guy coming from Texas.
I'm going to jump in here real quick because we have a very special caller on the line, gentlemen. He is a Quebec native, known to wrestling fans as both Michel Dubois and as the menacing Russian Alexis Smirnov. He's had successful runs all over the world, from Montreal to Mid-Atlantic to Amarillo to San Francisco to Japan to the AWA and Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF. I'm very excited to bring on the line right now Mike the Judge Dubois.
Is that Mike?
Yes, it is.
Great to have you on, Mike. I'm delighted you could make it, and a big fan of yours, have been for many years. You're one of the few French-Canadian stars that never quite made it up here, but I remember my dad was, for a long time, always trying to get you up here, and he had all the other French-Canadian stars up here, so I'd just like to thank you for coming on and, express my high regard for you.
I really appreciate that.
See, Mike, this is Pat. And I see that you're still a great heel, because I was right in the middle of something and you just came in and cut me off like a heel would do. So I'm glad things haven't changed.
I'm sorry about that, Pat. Somebody called me and just told me to call, and the person who answered me says push number 1 or listen to the radio. So I pushed number 1. So I'm sorry about that, Pat.
I did that myself today.
It's only justice.
On hold
it's
for
only
about 10
justice.
minutes on my own
yes,
show.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
What are you up to these days, Mike?
Well, I mean, not no good. Let's put it this way. I'm not doing too much. At my age now, I just kick back and relax, and it's about it,
You're in good health, I hope.
Well, I'm diabetic, and I lost a leg, and about 12 years ago. But as your brother saw me at Cauliflower Alley, and Pat saw me and everything, I handle the situation pretty well, and I walk pretty well, and it's my health, it's pretty good, and my diabetes is kind of a control it, as much as I can, it's
yeah. You sound you sound certainly sound of mind, you sound pretty sharp, and
oh yeah.
I'm glad to hear that, And,
yeah. By the way, I saw your brother Brett about a month ago. Yeah, he came down in the city of Newark. That's where, just in my neighborhood, my wife was born in that city in Newark, California.
Brett had a huge French-Canadian influence, as did most of the Hart Kiddies, from all the guys like Leo Burke and...
Leo Burke. You're talking, Leo Burke, you're talking of one of the best workers in the business.
Oh yeah,
And
very
I mean,
underrated. Not
yes,
many.
yes,
Brett would tell you the same, but
technically, Leo Burke broke me in the business and helped me so much, it's unreal. I spent 5 years there in the Maritime with the K family, with Bobby K, the Beast, Rudy K, and Leo. And Leo was such a great worker, to the point the first night that I wrestled with Bret Hart, your brother, it was in Chicago. And I start to work with him, and I mean, he started to sell, and I says, you know who you remind me? He says, no. I says, Leo Burke. He started to laugh. He said,
oh, yeah.
Well, Leo taught him a lot, and I could tell, and Leo taught me a whole lot.
I'm glad you had a chance to mention that, because definitely one of the most underrated, like a lot of people in the States don't know the name, but and Leo had a huge influence on guys like Edge and Christian and those guys.
Yeah.
He was training them up here with Brett. And one of the best ring psychologists I've seen. Old Leo. And he's still up here. He's.
Well, I was lucky. I talked to Ross, your brother, at the Cauliflower Alley, and he had the phone number of Leo, and I did get in touch with Leo 3-4 times since then. And it's always a pleasure to talk to him, and we'll probably going to have the chance to see each other next year at the Cauliflower Alley.
Oh, that's great. Leo was one of those guys, as I was mentioning before, who he took all these young guys, including like Dynamite and Davey and Benoit, and he would all the way back from Regina or Vancouver, where he'd have these long road trips, and Leo would be having a few beers, and he'd be schooling these guys and telling them slow down and work the crowd and take your time and build up the heat and all this kind of stuff. And that had an incredible effect on guys like Brett and Owen and those young guys. And a lot of people don't realize how important the influence of those veterans was, and that's one of the things that seems to be missing these days,
You got that right. And I got to tell you something, Leo Burke, to me, he is as good a worker as Harley Race can be, and Terry Funk and Dory Funk, and he's one of the best workers. I got to be honest with you, on the psychology of the business, Leo was my top guy, and after that it was Roy Shire, who was a promoter in San Francisco, when I came to San Francisco in 1977, when I started gimmick of Alexis Smirnoff.
Pat Patterson there then too, or?
Yeah, no, Pat was here, and we worked together for about a year and a half. There's another guy who's got a great psychology of the business. Those
are the kind of guys that everyone used to say that could work with a broomstick and make it look good.
Oh, yeah.
And Leo was like that.
Look good. Yeah.
They could take some big, clumsy, one-dimensional stiff and make him look like a world champion.
You got that right.
Did you know Leo was also back in 1987? He did French. He was a French commentator in Montreal for NWA. The NWA was trying something to see if it would catch on in the province of Quebec. So they had TV on a French network here, and Leo was the color commentator for that at the time where Ronnie Garvin was NWA World Champion. So it was, Leo had worked for International Wrestling for a few years. He even booked International Wrestling in the 80s for Gino Brito, and then people were able to see him back, on TV, since he was, he wasn't local, but he could speak French, and that was good enough for the people here, and he did that for maybe 6 months or 7 months with the NWA here in Montreal, and that's a little fact that people may not be aware of.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. I know he was in Montreal, then he was booker for Gino Brito and Dino Bravo, but I didn't know then he did commentator for a TV station, especially in French, because Leo, he's got an accent of, the New Brunswick accent.
Oh, yeah,
and,
pretty pronounced, yeah.
Yeah.
A friend of mine from the Maritimes once told me, we cannot speak good French and we cannot speak good English.
You got that right.
I think Leo had a lot to do with Rick Martel was sort of getting his feet wet back in the 70s up here, and I think Leo had a fair bit of influence on him too, and he became a very good ring psychologist. Martel, quite underrated too,
Yeah, but he was at the right place at the right time. He went to Minneapolis and they gave him the bell before he showed up there. And after that, because he did not like to work for Verne, not too many people did. But anyway, and after that, when he went to New York, he had a good run in New York, as a tag team.
Yeah, I always thought they wasted him. I didn't think the male model gimmick was that. I think if they just had him, I always thought Rick's big strength was he knew how to really sell, and he knew come back with great fire, and
yes.
And they never really used him as a face down there, a good-looking guy and all the other. I thought my estimation was they missed a boat on him, or they could have got a lot more mileage just pushing him as a face, because he had that same, like you see guys today like Daniel Bryan, and that's his big strong suit is the sell and the comeback. And Martel had some of, he was one of the best guys in the business at selling, and he came back with that big fire, and that was something WWE sort of missed the boat on him. They had him as the male model and all that other. It was to me all right, but
I'm gonna tell you something. I think WWE or WWF back then had something against the Quebec province people. I mean, let's put it this way. Pat can probably answer you that. They had a hard time to come in because of Dino Bravo, and finally, when they took over, they took over the top talent of Quebec.
Yeah, I think that was
actually, that's a very interesting story about Montreal and the WWE invasion of the around 86, 87 when they totally took over the territory. Is that they did, like they did everywhere else, took over most of the stars of the territory. But they were actually afraid that if they left everybody to be babyface in Montreal, that they would overshadow Hogan. And that was a big, big issue with them, and that's the main reason that Dino Bravo was turned heel, was to make sure that when they were running Montreal, and at that time they were running Montreal every 4 weeks at the most, and they didn't want to risk the fact that Dino might overshadow Hogan, and that was a business decision that they made at that time. And even the match that was at one point on the book to be first ever meeting of Dino for the WWE title against Hogan at the Forum, or maybe even at the Olympic Stadium they were talking about, was finally put aside because they didn't want to do that match and have Hogan be the babyface and Dino be the heel and get a crowd reaction they didn't want to get. Even Jerry Briscoe at one point told us that they were afraid that there might be some riot if Dino and Hogan would meet and Hogan would beat him and that Dino would be the bad guy in the scenario. That was how over Dino was at that time. So it was a decision that they decided they went on and made, and inside this 2020 the territory knew a big peak, and Hogan became a huge star in Montreal, maybe the biggest non-Quebec star since Edouard Carpentier. But it was what they did everywhere, and Hogan was the main guy, and everybody else was to be put in a position that would not overshadow the star. A little bit like today, Cena is still the guy that drives the business, so they need to make sure that that the feature and the spotlight is on the guy that they believe is pulling the business, and that's what they did back then. But even for the models, when Rick became the model, that was actually Rick's idea, because he didn't want to be a baby face anymore at that point. He wanted to try to be a heel like his brother Michel had been before, and he's the one who kind of pushed the issue with WWE to become a heel, even threatened to quit the company at the time. That's one of the stories that you will read in our book about Montreal and its wrestler.
The other thing, guys, also is that Montreal was, at the same time that Montreal got invaded by WWF, Calgary was also, and soon after, New Orleans was also invaded, and yeah, exactly, and Minneapolis, of course, with all the talent they took from Vern, but Montreal was special in the sense that the people running the Montreal Forum forced Vince and the WWF to actually share the forum with International Wrestling. Basically, what they told Vince is that we have a local promotion here that drives good business. And we're not looking at kicking them out of the forum. So if you want to run the forum, you better strike a deal with them and work together. And that's why at the end of 1985, for 4 months, there were joint shows between WWF and International Wrestling, something that you didn't see in Calgary, Minneapolis, or New Orleans. And that's why they did those shows, and of course after a few months, WWF was in the forum. They were able to pull the strings, and by January of 1986, they made a deal with International Wrestling. They would take over the forum, and they would leave them the Quebec City Coliseum, and that's pretty much what happened. And since then, there was not a local promotion able to run the Montreal Forum or now the Bell Center on a regular basis. But that's something that was unheard of and special about Montreal compared to other territories that got invaded pretty much the same way, by taking television and the talent. But Montreal was able at least to get a few joint shows out of WWF for a few months.
Yeah, they actually fought neck to neck in the market up until the December of '85, and from that point on, '86, you can actually see how the year, the crowd are going down. The more we go towards the year, all much so that in between December '85 and December '86, it's a totally different business. The big show at the end of the year was the Christmas show. They drew a big, huge sellout at the Paul Sauvé Arena in December of '85. Huge business. A year later, Super Show, Christmas, December '86, less than 1,000 at the Paul Sauvé for the same promotion. So it was a huge blow, but they fought until the bitter end, and Gino Brito will tell that today, that maybe he should have not have fought that long, because he almost put himself on the street trying to fight Vince at that point in time. And but they did fight until the bitter end, and they were fighting a good fight. But the WWE business at that time, was not just like doing 1 + 1. It was 1 + 1 + 10, then multiplication by 20. It was going too fast for anybody to follow. So it's fun today to go back and be able to talk to those guys and get the story and try to put everything back into perspective, and trying also to protect that history. As we were doing those interviews, like a guy like Edouard Carpentier, who spoke with Pat twice about wrestling, the last 2 wrestling interviews he ever did, and getting that history from those guys is so important today to try to preserve that time, because it was so much a secret back then that if we don't get it now, it will be lost forever, and it will be a shame, because I know that at the Performance Center they have a huge library now where guys can actually read about the history of pro wrestling through books like that, like our book and other books. And I think it's important that they try to understand why we are where we are today and where everybody was back then and how everything has changed and how you can adapt maybe to pick the best from the past and move on into the future.
I wish those megalomaniacs in Connecticut would hear guys like you saying that, because that's the biggest threat to the existence of the survival of this business is the fact that the grassroots are all these places that were once hotbeds of wrestling, like Montreal and some of the places you guys have alluded to, like San Francisco and Portland and Calgary and Minneapolis and Kansas City. That was the grassroots of the business, and it shouldn't have been considered a threat to Vince. They should have been considered, useful, valuable places for him to develop talent and to send those guys out when their faces needed a rest and all that other. And that's the big problem with the business today, and that's why they have to keep bringing back all these old retreads, like The Rock or Brock Lesnar or whatever, because the up-and-coming talent, not to be knocking it, isn't up to the task. And there's fewer and fewer Randy Ortons out there, and you don't become a Randy Orton or a Bret Hart or a Ric Flair or whatever overnight. You got to work the territories and learn how to work and learn how to interact with the fans and all that other. And they take all these one-dimensional stiffs and put them in the ring.
They're trying to sign different kind of talent. I mean, 5 years ago, I would have not thought that a guy like Sami Zayn with his smaller shape would have been hired, or a guy like Kevin Steen, who is maybe a bit bigger, and people were actually knocking him about his being overweight. And I wasn't thinking that maybe 5 years ago they would go for him. And they did. So I think, we have to give them a chance to actually see what they can do with it.
It's sort of like a souped-up version of what the Dungeon used to be. But the other part that they're missing is the fan base. Like, it's all well and good to have a damn place like the Performance Center or whatever the hell else, but you still need to be sustaining your fan base, which is something that's been missing the last 20 years. There was like 30 territories running 5-6 days a week, and you were sustaining your fan base and those people. Their kids were coming and all of that. I know they come to Calgary maybe once every 18 months. You can't sustain your damned fan base coming once or twice a year.
Where are you going to go today and say, hey, I got to wrestle 5 nights a week, 6 nights a week, and I got to make $1,000, $1,200 a week, like back in the old days. I remember back in my days, that's the way it was, and I did only about 6-7 territory in my history.
But guys, we could go on and on for hours talking about this, but at the same time, it's not the territorial eras anymore. I mean, there's no more territories, and WWE is now the only place where you can actually have a shot of making good money, and if you want to make a living out of it, well, that's the place to be, and not for good or bad, but that's the case now. And I still believe that it's a different era, and I do believe too that the territorial era was working territories to territories and learning different kind of wrestling and learning through different opponents and different crowd was a heck of a training and experiment.
That was one of if I might add, one of the strengths of that whole system was, I know in Calgary, you'd bring guys in from like Montreal, you'd bring guys in from Tennessee or Texas or Portland or England or Japan or whatever the hell, and they would add a new flavor to the work. That was one reason why the brand of wrestling in Stampede was incredible because you had guys like Dynamite and Davey, and you had the French Canadian guys like Leo, and you had these guys from the States like David Schultz and Honky Tonk, and guys like Terry Funk up here. And I'm sure Mike would tell you the same. You know, every territory had a blend of different guys from different territories, and you know, you don't see that in WWE. You got this stale, stagnant brand of wrestling, and half the guys can't wrestle 5 minutes without you know, needing the referee to tell them what the hell to do, you know, and everything's scripted, which to me is an insult to the wrestlers and to the fans, you know. But back in the day, I'm sure Mike would tell you the same. If somebody came up and gave you a script, you know, 20-minute script, oh, you do this, and you know, they would tell you to shove it, you know. Because back in the day, the guys took pride in their work, you know, and they didn't want somebody telling them what to do, you know. That's all you'd ever do is give them a damn finish.
Yeah, exactly. And they were giving you, 30 seconds for the finish, and they will say, well, go about, especially if we were on TV.
They had a saying, I'm sure you heard it, Mike, a million times, play it by ear, you know. And,
exactly, play by ear, And they're giving you a finish.
That's what all the great workers played it by ear, the Leo Burks or the Harley Races or the Dory Funks, you know. You never give, you know, they'd come out and have a 60-minute Broadway and have the crowd on fire. And all you'd ever do is give them the damn finish. You know, the rest was all this kind of ad lib or, you know, improv.
Create their own history, you know, create their own story.
And most people forget when you're doing that, what you're doing is engaging the fans, which is what it's all about.
Exactly,
When you're scripting the damn thing, you're basically saying, screw the fans, you guys don't have any part in this. We're just going to shove this shit down your throat whether you like it or not, you know. And
you're right.
And I know my brother Brett told me that many a time, you know, like in WWE they got so much scripting that you feel like you got you know, shackles on. You can't even use your own intuition. And yet they still make out like you know, it's working, you know. It's only a few guys I see that break free from that, maybe Shawn Michaels and Randy Orton and a few of them, but all the rest you see this damned looks like you know, paint by numbers or some shit, you know. And my dad used to say he never saw any paint by numbers paintings in any museums, so that sort of sums up.
Yeah, right.
If today's wrestling is just crap, let's stop wasting time and let's go back talking about how great Montreal was in the day.
Oh yeah, tell me who. I forgive me for interjecting there, but I'd love to hear some perspectives from you guys on just who you guys rate as some of the very best of the Montreal. You know, that's what we're talking about here. So, who were some of the really elite guys?
I got to tell you something. Even myself, I wrestled with Johnny Rougeau, Jacques Rougeau, Edouard Carpentier, Maurice Vachon, Gino Brito, Dino Bravo, Raymond
Some incredible
Rougeau,
names.
Joe Leduc, Jacques Rougeau Jr., The Sheik, who was coming in from Detroit, Abdullah the Butcher, who was doing Calgary, Montreal. I mean, this is just to give you an example. And I mean an example in the Maritime Province. J.J. Dillon started there. Ronnie Piper started there on the second match. You know, I mean, you can go back and you had the Key family there, and it was the same, you know, 6 months. And Montreal we were having a great time, and we were doing all those towns like Quebec, Montreal, Sherbrooke, all. Pat can name it, and Pat wrote all of a book about all those guys from Montreal, and you got a Hans Schmidt who's from Montreal, and other great talent back in the day of Johnny Rougeau and Jacques Rougeau, and even my time, he was there. We had a bunch of a guy who were all French Canadian mostly, and most of the heel were coming in from the state. That's the reason why I became a heel, because I could speak the language, and the people were really freaked out because I was speaking the language and I was one of them, and I was a heel. Most of the heel were coached by Eddie Creechman or a manager, Tony Angelo, an example, but Eddie Creechman was the best. So, and we went years and years and years and years in Montreal, and even Gino Brito and Dino Bravo had it going for a while. They had it going very well till New York came in and took all the talent, and that was it.
Yeah,
but the thing about Montreal, it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s, before WWF came over, is that it was an independent territory. It wasn't linked to the NWA. It wasn't linked to the AWA. It wasn't linked to WWF. Or it wasn't linked to the own IWA. It was really an independent territory.
I'm sorry about that, Pat, but Johnny Rougeau for a long time belonged to NWA.
Eddie Quinn died in like 61, was it? Something like that.
Yeah, Quinn died in 64, and Quinn was the last promoter from Montreal to actually have his NWA license. Johnny never had the NWA license.
Well, how come he had the right to vote for the world champion?
He didn't.
Because he
maybe
told
that's
me.
what he was saying at the time, but I mean, if you look at there was a guy named Tim Hornbaker who did that great book about the NWA and its history, and Johnny was not a voting member at any time.
Okay, I'll take your word because you made a lot of, Pat, I know you did a lot of research and everything. I'll take your word, but I remember one night when Harley Race took the belt, switched the belt to Terry Funk in Toronto. He turned around the day before. He told me, he says, there's going to be a big change on the NWA. I says, what do you mean? He says, Terry Funk's going to take the belt from Harley Race, or Harley Race took it from Terry, one of the two. I says, well, how do you know? He says, well, I vote.
Well, maybe he wasn't the know. Maybe he wasn't the know, but at the time, the NWA champion wasn't even coming to Montreal. So I mean, if Johnny would have been part of the NWA at the time, we would have seen the champion in Montreal,
you're right. But
that's the thing. That's the thing that was awesome about Montreal is that talents from all over the country and all over North America was able to come and work here. Since it wasn't linked to any of the top three, even in the 80s, we saw guys like Ric Flair and guys like Nick Bockwinkel and John Butzeruta, who was working with Vern at the time, come here, and it was the same in the 70s and the 60s when Johnny and Grand Prix Wrestling started. So that's one thing that was special about the territory is that. We were getting talent from all over the place.
Yeah, but Pat and Bruce going to probably agree with me on that. Calgary did not need the NWA or AWA or WWE or whatever you want to mention. We had our own little independent territory.
Oh, yeah, you'd bring the champion in. You'd bring the champion once a year, maybe.
Stampede. Yeah, at the Calgary Stampede.
That was it.
Right?
Bring Harley or Dory or Briscoe up for 1 week.
Even New Brunswick were using Harley Race and Terry Funk when they were champion, and Dory Funk for a week.
Yeah,
they were independent. Yeah, that's all. I mean, we did not need back in those days. First of all, they were taking a percentage of the territory, which Johnny Rougeau did not want to give a certain percentage, and also your dad did want to give a certain percentage of his territory.
They would never let you switch a belt or anything either. It was always a one-way street. I think Dusty and all those guys were playing games with the NWA belt, and I remember they canceled Harley about 3 weeks' notice, so my dad contacted Vern Gagne, and he sent Bockwinkel up instead, and after that, my dad, even though my dad had been in the NWA since 1950, basically said, screw you guys, I'm no longer going to use your champion. And it started going down the toilet around that time. There nobody was sticking together, and they had a few guys down in the south there that were pretty much controlling it. It just kind of went down the toilet then, and that was one of the reasons why Vinny had it so easy.
North Carolina, you had the Crockett, North Carolina, you had Atlanta with Paul Jones, and you had Florida,
with
that
Eddie
was
Graham.
Louisiana. Yeah, Eddie Graham. I mean, this was all the clique of the NWA back then,
Yeah.
And they were powerful. Dory Funk was the booker for how many years? Dory Funk was the booker with Sam Muchnick for how many years?
Well, I hate to tell you, gentlemen, this, but the show is coming to a close. I'd like to give Pat and Bertrand an opportunity to tell all the fans out there once more, how can we all pick up a copy of Mad Dogs, Midgets, and Screwjobs, The Untold Story of How Montreal Shaped the World of Wrestling?
Yes, the book is available everywhere, good bookstores, Amazon.ca, or any online sellers. It was Book of the Year in 2013 by the Wrestling Observer, so I think it's a sign of quality. And we also have some DVDs available through iSpots.com and RSVideo.com with the best of Montreal wrestling from the 70s and 80s. Whatever is still available out there, it's on those DVDs. So I would suggest to anyone who missed good old-time wrestling to go and check those DVD out.
Good luck on the book. I just got a chance to read it this weekend, and I couldn't put it down. I gained a lot of insight. There was a lot, even though I've been around the business for 40-plus years.
And I want to highly recommend to all you fans out there listening to pick up this book. It is the absolute authority on Montreal wrestling. Whether it's Andre the Giant, or Dino Bravo, or Gino Brito, or the Vachons, or many of the other men we've talked about here today, this is one wrestling book you are not going to want to miss. And I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in to Heartbeat Radio today. Bruce, thank you very much. Pat, Bertrand, Michelle, it is very much appreciated. I feel truly enlightened, and I am sure all the fans listening do too. We'll talk to you all again next week here on Heartbeat Radio.